On Thursday, October 15th, 2026, at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon, a woman I had never met before told me she'd marry me if I could fix her Bentley. She was joking. Two of her personal PR assistants laughed on cue. I dropped the specialized undercarriage shielding of the custom Mulsanne Grand Limousine sitting on the hydraulic lift of her private estate, shone my flashlight up into the transmission casing for approximately 11 seconds, and stopped breathing. I knew this steel. I had seen the blueprint schematics on our dining room table in the winter of 2022 when I was 35 years old, when my wife Sarah was still alive, when our daughter Linda hadn't started school yet, and when the woman who personally engineered this titanium reinforcement plate was still teaching me how to look at structural stress lines the way other people look at brushstrokes on a canvas. The tech CEO who owned the car had no idea what she had just walked into. She thought she was making a light-hearted joke to pass the time with a quiet mechanic in grease-stained coveralls who had pulled up to her multi-million-dollar compound in a rusted 2016 Chevy Silverado with a working-class zip code on the bumper. What she didn't know was that the answer to her prototype's fatal glitch was sitting in a digital CAD folder on an encrypted hard drive in the locked drawer of my garage workbench, saved under my late wife's private signature 4 years ago. A project she called her legacy build, paid for by a company the CEO ran but clearly didn't fully control. By the time we figured out what was really wrong with that Bentley's transmission, the billionaire laughing at me in her immaculate garage that afternoon would be pushed to the absolute brink of corporate ruin, and I would be the only person standing between her and the man who was orchestrating her downfall. My Thursday had started the way most of my Thursdays started, with a transmission fluid leak on a 2019 F-150 that a client had been ignoring for 3 weeks, a parts supplier on hold for 11 minutes, and Linda eating cereal at the edge of the workbench because the school bus came late and she'd rather sit in the garage with me than wait alone in the kitchen. She was 8 years old and already had her mother's habit of watching things in silence. Machinery, people, problems. Like she was reading something the rest of the world hadn't noticed was written there. The shop had been bleeding quietly for 14 months. Not hemorrhaging. Just the slow, steady kind of financial erosion that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It just shrinks your margins, delays your equipment upgrades, and makes you do mental math at 2 in the morning that always comes out slightly wrong. I had 2 full-time employees, 1 part-timer, a commercial lease on a building I was 3 months from renegotiating, and a reputation in the borough that was genuinely good but not the kind that translated into the margins I needed. I was skilled. I was solvent. I was tired. The call came in at 11:42 that morning from a private coordinator I had never spoken to before, using language that made it immediately clear this was not a standard service request. A vehicle. Private estate in the Heights. A timeline that did not accommodate rescheduling. The rate she quoted for a single diagnostic visit was more than I cleared in a slow week. She didn't tell me what the car was. She didn't need to. The money said everything about what kind of problem this was going to be, the kind that couldn't wait and couldn't be handed to just anyone. I told Linda I'd pick her up from school. The estate garage was the size of a small aircraft hangar, climate-controlled to a temperature that felt engineered rather than comfortable, lit by overhead panels that made everything look like it was being examined rather than simply seen. The Mulsanne sat at the center of it with the quiet authority of something that knew its own value. I had the undercarriage shielding off in under 4 minutes. The coordinator who had escorted me in checked her phone and said nothing. Then I put the flashlight on it. The titanium plate was exactly where Sarah had designed it to sit, nested against the lower transmission casing at a 17-degree inward angle that no standard manufacturer spec would have called for, that no conventional stress analysis would have arrived at without the particular methodology Sarah had spent 18 months developing, and that I recognized the way you recognize a person's handwriting even when you haven't seen it in years. The weld geometry, the micro-perforated relief channels along the lateral edge. The chamfered corner that was 2 millimeters shallower on the left side than the right. Not an error, but a deliberate thermal compensation she had argued for in 3 separate design reviews before anyone listened to her. She used to call it her hummingbird detail. Too small for most people to notice. Exactly precise enough to matter. I stood there with the flashlight angled up into that casing and felt the garage disappear. I was back at our dining room table in February of 2022 with blueprint schematics spread across the dinner plates we hadn't cleared. Linda asleep upstairs. Sarah's reading glasses pushed up into her hair as she traced a stress line with her thumbnail and said, "This is the part they'll get wrong if I'm not there to protect it." She wasn't there to protect it. She hadn't been there for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. And someone had built it anyway. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen on the titanium plate. I pulled my expression back to neutral the way you learn to when you've spent 15 years delivering bad news about engines to people who don't want to hear it, and I asked the coordinator for uninterrupted access and a clean parts tray. She hesitated, then left. The transmission control unit came out in stages. It was a layered system more complex than production Mulsons, hybridized with aerospace-grade sensor architecture that I recognized from Sarah's secondary spec documents, the one she called the nervous system builds. Whoever had finished her work had done it competently. Competently enough that the sabotage was almost invisible. Almost. It was buried in the 4th diagnostic sublayer of the software stack, nested inside a routine that would read as completely inert during any standard pre-demonstration systems check. A script. 17 lines of embedded code sitting dormant in the shift logic controller like a splinter that hadn't yet worked its way deep enough to cause pain. It was designed to activate under one specific condition, a sustained high-load acceleration sequence held for more than 40 seconds, the exact performance profile that would be triggered during a live corporate demonstration on a closed circuit. At activation, it would introduce a cascading hydraulic pressure miscommunication between the transmission and the rear differential that would present initially as a minor hesitation, then escalate within 90 seconds to a full mechanical seizure at speed. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a manufacturing defect. It was a sentence, written deliberately, planted carefully, and timed to detonate in public in front of exactly the audience whose opinion mattered most. I sat back on my heels in that immaculate garage and understood that I hadn't been called here to fix a car. I had been called here to find this. The question was by whom? I didn't open the encrypted drive that night. I sat in the Silverado outside Linda's school for 6 minutes before she came through the gate, watching her walk with that particular careful attention she gave to sidewalk cracks, and I decided that whatever I had found in that garage needed to be handled with the same precision it had been planted with. Rushed hands had never served me well on anything that mattered. It was past midnight when I finally unlocked the drawer. Sarah's CAD logs were organized the way she organized everything, chronologically on the surface, but cross-referenced internally by a private indexing system she had built herself and explained to me once over coffee in a way I had mostly followed. It took me 40 minutes to locate the Mulson project thread. It took me another 20 to understand what I was looking at. The original specification files were intact. Her annotations were there, the margin notes in her shorthand, the version flags, the highlighted stress point queries she had submitted formally to the Project Oversight Committee in the spring of 2022. What was also there, time-stamped 11 weeks after her death, was a set of authorization signatures that had rerouted the titanium reinforcement procurement contract to a shell vendor I didn't recognize, at a materials cost that was nearly 3 times the figure Sarah had negotiated and documented. The signature belonged to Marcus Vance. I ran it again. Then I pulled his name against the project development ledger Sarah had kept as a personal audit record, a habit her engineering supervisor had apparently found excessive and unnecessary. She had kept it anyway. Across 14 months of development, The pattern was methodical and deliberate. Altered specifications, inflated vendor invoices, payments absorbed into procurement layers that existed on paper and nowhere else. He hadn't just stolen from the project. He had dismantled Sarah's work from the inside, redirected its funding, and left a bomb in its place. The only thing I couldn't yet answer was whether he had known she would die before she could see what he had done to it. The bypass took 4 hours. It was painstaking, deliberate work, the kind that requires you to hold 2 versions of a system in your head simultaneously, the corrupted one and the one it was meant to be, and navigate the distance between them without disturbing anything you don't fully understand. Sarah had taught me that discipline. She called it reading the intention of the design rather than just its current state. I had applied it to engines for years without fully crediting where it came from. By 3:40 in the morning, the script was isolated, excised cleanly, and the shift logic controller was running on a restored command hierarchy that matched Sarah's original nervous system architecture precisely. I ran the diagnostics sequence twice, then a third time. The transmission responded the way it had been designed to respond before someone decided it shouldn't make it to the demonstration. Lila Voss came into the garage at 7 in the morning in a different kind of quiet than the night before. The coordinator had called her. She stood at a measured distance and watched me reassemble the undercarriage shielding with the expression of someone recalibrating what they thought they understood about the previous 18 hours. When I was finished, she named a number. A bonus, she called it. It was significant enough that I registered it physically. A slight tightening across the shoulders that I recognized as the feeling of being offered something that would genuinely change the immediate arithmetic of my life. Linda's school fees, the lease renegotiation, the equipment I had been deferring for 8 months. I told her I didn't want it. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite confusion but was adjacent to it. I picked up the flash drive from the parts tray, held it for a moment, and set it on the hood of the Mulsanne between us. I told her everything on that drive was documented, time-stamped, and cross-referenced against original project files authored by the engineer who designed the titanium reinforcement plate she'd been driving over for the past 8 months. I told her the sabotage was internal. I told her the financial trail was clean enough to prosecute. And I told her that the engineer's name was Sarah Aurelius, that she had died in October of 2022, and that her signature was on every page of the work that someone in her own company had spent 2 years trying to erase. Lila Voss didn't laugh this time. She picked up the drive with both hands. I wasn't in the boardroom. I heard about what happened there the way you hear about most things that occur in rooms you'll never be invited into, in fragments through intermediaries, with the particular flatness of second-hand accounts that have already been filtered through someone else's shock. What I knew directly was this. Lila Voss called her general counsel from the driveway of the estate at 7:53 in the morning while I was loading the Silverado. The call lasted for minutes. A second call went out 11 minutes later to the chair of the audit committee. By noon, a forensic accounting firm had been granted emergency access to the project development ledgers. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the live prototype launch, scheduled for a closed-circuit demonstration in front of 11 board members, for institutional investors and 2 members of the automotive press, had been quietly postponed with language about final calibration adjustments that no one in that room entirely believed. Marcus Vance arrived at the board session at 4:30 expecting to present the quarterly development summary. He left it 3 hours later without his access credentials, his company devices, or the particular posture of a man who still believed the ground beneath him was solid. The forensic trail Sarah had inadvertently preserved in her private audit logs was, by every account I later received, exceptionally clean. Not circumstantially suggestive, prosecutably clean. The kind of documentation that makes defense attorneys go quiet. 14 months of diverted procurement funds. A shell vendor registered to a holding company with his brother-in-law's address. Specification alterations timed precisely to the periods following Sarah's formal objections. And underneath all of it, her original work, intact, correctly attributed, and entirely vindicated by the car that had run flawlessly on the diagnostic sequence at 3:40 that morning. The embezzlement figure, when the audit completed its first pass, was $4.3 million. The board voted to refer the matter to federal prosecutors before the session adjourned. He came on a Tuesday, 9 days after the board session, at 6:48 in the evening. I know the exact time because Linda had after-school chess club on Tuesdays and I had exactly 1 hour between dropping her at the Petersons and picking her up at 8, which was the only reliable window in my week when the shop was empty and I was genuinely alone. I have thought about that timing many times since. It was not a coincidence. The side door opened without a knock. He was taller than I had expected from the photographs Lila's coordinator had inadvertently left visible on a tablet in the estate garage. Well-dressed in the specific way of men who use clothing to communicate authority to rooms they've already decided they own. He looked at my shop the way certain people look at spaces that don't conform to their internal map of where serious things happen, and then he looked at me, and whatever he saw apparently confirmed something he had already decided. He opened with money. A number delivered with the rehearsed casualness of someone who had used it before to make problems resolve themselves quietly. It was more than the bonus Lila had offered. Considerably more. He framed it as compensation for my discretion going forward, for the return of any copied files, for the general cooperative understanding that a working mechanic with a small shop and a child to raise had more practical use for financial stability than for involvement in a corporate legal matter that didn't concern him. I let him finish. Then he said Linda's name. He said it the way you'd mention a fact, flatly, without decoration, and followed it with the specific detail of her Tuesday chess club, the name of the street, the approximate time the Peterson house went dark. The shop went very quiet. He smiled with the patience of a man who had learned that silence after a certain kind of sentence usually meant the conversation was going his way. He had misread the silence entirely. I had installed the security system 14 months ago, 2 weeks after a catalytic converter theft that cost me $1,800 and 6 hours of police paperwork that produced nothing. For cameras, 2 of them covered the interior of the shop from opposite diagonal angles, which was standard. The third was positioned above the parts shelving along the east wall, angled specifically to capture the side door and the workbench directly in front of it, which was where Marcus Vance had been standing for the previous 6 minutes. The fourth was outside. The diagnostic microphones were Sarah's idea, technically. She had suggested integrated audio capture for the workbench area 3 years ago as a quality documentation tool, a way of recording verbal notes during complex disassembly sequences without stopping to type. I had implemented it 8 months after she died, partly for that purpose and partly because grief makes you finish things. All 4 cameras had been running. The audio had been running. The timestamp was clean, the angles were unambiguous, and Marcus Vance had said Linda's name and the street and the specific detail about the Peterson house clearly enough that no transcript would require interpretation. I told him none of this while he was still in the shop. I held the silence he had mistaken for capitulation for a few seconds longer, told him I needed to think about what he was offering, and watched him leave with the satisfied bearing of a man who believed he had just solved his most pressing problem. Then I called the number Lila's general counsel had given me 11 days earlier and told me to use if anything changed. The federal prosecutor I reached was thorough, unhurried, and asked me to send the footage before we discussed next steps. I sent it from the shop's cloud backup at 7:22 in the evening. She called back at 7:51. The arrest warrant for witness intimidation and obstruction was processed the following morning. Marcus Vance was taken into custody at 11:15, 40 minutes before he was scheduled to meet with his own attorney to discuss his defense strategy. I was at the shop when my phone buzzed with the update. Linda was at the workbench doing homework, eating an apple, watching me the way she watched everything. I told her it was good news. She nodded once, as if she had already suspected as much, and went back to her fractions. The sentencing was in March. 48 months, federal facility, with restitution ordered on the full $4.3 million. I did not attend the hearing. I had given my deposition in November, sat across a conference table from 2 federal attorneys for 3.5 hours, and said everything that needed to be said in rooms designed for exactly that purpose. The courthouse itself held nothing I needed to witness. The verdict reached me by text from Lila's general counsel at 2:17 in the afternoon while I was replacing a water pump on a 2020 Camry, and I read it once, set the phone face down on the parts tray, and finished the job. Lila came to the shop on a Saturday in April, unannounced, without a coordinator or a PR assistant. She drove herself. The car she arrived in was the Mulsanne. She parked it on the apron in front of the bay doors with the particular care of someone who understood what they were carrying, got out, and looked at the shop for a moment before she looked at me. She was quieter than she had been in her own garage 6 months earlier. The lightness she had worn like a professional accessory that first afternoon had been replaced by something more considered. I recognized it as the expression of someone who had spent several months learning the full dimensions of what they had almost lost. She didn't make a speech. She held out the keys and told me the prototype had been formally withdrawn from the commercial development pipeline, that the board had voted unanimously to retire it from production in its current form, and that its disposition had been left entirely to her discretion. She said Sarah's name carefully, the way people say the names of those they never met but have come to know through the shape of their absence in other people's lives. I took the keys. Linda was sitting on the workbench behind me. She slid down and walked to the car slowly, the way she approached everything worth examining, and put her small hand flat on the hood just above where the titanium plates sat beneath layers of steel and engineering and her mother's precise and patient intelligence. She stood there for a moment without speaking. Then she looked up at me with her mother's eyes and said it was a good car. It was the finest thing anyone had said in my garage in years, possibly ever. I told her she was right, and I meant it about more than the car, and I think she understood that because she nodded once with the quiet certainty of a child who has learned to read the things that don't get said out loud. We locked up at 6. I let Linda choose the radio. The Silverado pulled out of the lot with the Mulsanne sitting in the locked bay behind us, and the evening came in low and unhurried over the borough, and for the first time in 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days, the weight of the week ahead felt like something I could carry without bracing for it. If the story stayed with you, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting, and I don't want you to miss them. Drop a comment below telling me which chapter hit hardest. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about quiet people doing extraordinary things, share this with them today. I'll see you in the next one.